Howdy, gang, and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Today, I am going to share my review of A War Transformed from Osprey Games. This is designed by Frederick Silburn Slater with artwork provided by Dimitrios Martinos. The 224-page hardcover is available now, carries an MSRP of $35, or you can grab just the PDF alone over at DriveThruRPG for $24.50. All that said, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got A War Transformed. Should mention the fine folks over at Osprey Games were kind enough to provide me with this review copy, but neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. These days, it's very important that you know that. We're also not going to look at each and every page of the book, but I do want to give you a good feel for what you're going to find inside A War Transformed and share my thoughts about the game too. So let's get stuck in. First of all, A War Transformed is a miniatures game. So this is set during the First World War, and it's kind of a mashup of war game and folk horror game. So I like that quite a bit. The setting is very unique. So what's taking place here is in 1916, during World War I, an asteroid hits the moon and knocks it out of its orbit, which causes a lot of changes to the Earth, one being the tidal changes. So we do see some areas where the oceans recede, and one of those areas is the Doggerland Bank, which of course now provides Europe with a land bridge to England, thus causing some serious problems for the English and making the Doggerland Bank a key strategic area for everyone to be fighting over. What's also taking place is the return of pagan gods. So suddenly, various different peoples start worshiping all these different old pagan gods. And now we suddenly have monsters and creatures. And some of these units aren't really soldiers anymore. They're crazed zealots. And there's folk magic. It's really, really unique, very interesting. To be honest, I think the setting could easily support a role-playing game. So maybe we would see something like that down the line from Osprey Games in the future. So this is not a skirmish level miniatures game. Important to keep that in mind. You will have more units on the game table than you see in a lot of the popular Osprey Games miniature systems, say Stargrave or Frostgrave. Here you can have upwards of 50 models on the table for each faction. That is taking up a lot of space. Those are a lot of models. Now, speaking of the models, we do have our characteristics for each unit. So as an example, we have pace. So that is the number of inches that that unit will move in an activation. Strangely enough, when a unit charges, their pace is divided in half. And I really can't think of any miniatures games that I have played that when a unit charges, they lose movement, so they don't move as far. So I thought that was unusual. We also have our martial skill. We have our zeal. So zeal is going to affect morale as well as close combat. We have models. So this is the number of models in the unit, unless it happens to be a single model unit. It might have additional hits. So instead of showing models, it'll show wounds. We have a saving throw. So on any hit, any wound that's taken, some units have the ability to make a saving throw. There are critical hits, which can't be saved unless the unit is allowed to save against critical hits. So that's something to keep in mind. Not every unit has the ability to deal out critical hits, though. We do have keywords. One aspect of the rules that plays a big part in A War Transformed happens to be keywords. And then we'll see what sort of equipment, what sort of weapons that unit might have. Now, something I also want to mention here that I thought was kind of odd was the designer decided to use the terms advantage and disadvantage. And the reason why I mention it seeming odd is because even if gamers don't have a lot of experience with role-playing games, they will still look at advantage and disadvantage as it's used in a lot of games. So advantage normally is you roll 2 dice rather than 1. You take the better result from those 2 dice. Disadvantage is the exact opposite. Here, advantage is simply a positive modifier, disadvantage a negative modifier. So why it's not just +1, -1, as opposed to advantage 1, disadvantage 2, and so forth, kind of threw me a little bit. So as far as the rule system itself, most of it is fairly well laid out and easy to understand. So what we're going to do is each of the factions will have command tokens that they utilize to spend to give orders to various different units. So normally, especially if you're playing a larger battle, you are not going to have enough command tokens at your disposal to do everything you want to do. So you'll have a bit of a balancing act. I definitely like that. So each of the rounds is going to be broken up into phases. So we've got our command phase, which is where we are going to be issuing orders. We have our close combat. So that is a sub-phase that takes place. We have compulsory moves. So if following close combat, you have units which have broken and are now retreating, that would be a compulsory move. And then we get into our activation phases. So we have candidate phase for artillery. We've got elite phase for, obviously enough, our elite units. And then we have the line phase for our rank and file units. We also have mindless units, which can come into play as well. So we get some rules breaking down the different phases. And then we're going to start talking about movement. For the most part, the movement rules are easily understood. One of the big things is you can't move through a unit. You have to go around another unit. You can't stop your movement in the mix of another unit. There is also unit cohesion. So if you have multiple models in the unit, you have to be within a certain distance of each other. So like I said, all in all, movement rules, pretty easy to figure out. Now, unfortunately, when we get into combat, things start to get a little clunky, especially with close combat. The reason why I mention this is because if this were a skirmish level game, I probably wouldn't have as much of an issue with the combat rules as I do with the fact that you could have a lot of models at the table. So as an example, we've got close combat. You're going to be looking at all these different tables. Then you're going to be rolling dice. You're going to have to figure out how many dice do I get to roll? What are hits? So I'll kind of give you an idea of what you're looking at here. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to have to figure out how many attack dice do you get to use? And it is based on the zeal of that unit as well as the strength of that unit. So if it's at full strength, you get to use the number of dice equal to its zeal. So if it's at more than half strength or half strength, less than half strength, if it's down to one model, that is going to adjust the number of attack dice you get. Then if you have any single model units which are attached to the close combat, you then need to figure out how many attack dice you're rolling for that. Now, these are 6-sided dice. Then you're going to roll all those attack dice, and then you have to look to see, okay, what are the martial skills for these units? Low, medium, or high. Then we've got critical hits. So we've got all these things taking place, and we haven't even applied any wounds yet. So next, after we've figured out our hits, then we're going to have saving throws. And each of the units are going to have possibly saving throws for them to utilize. Now, the weird thing is, we actually make our saving throws before we take the wounds. So if you do have single model units which are attached to the close combat, they're going to have a different saving throw. I kind of thought that was odd that we do that in that order as opposed to taking the wounds and then, or at least assigning potential wounds and then making saving throws. Like I said, kind of clunky there. And then after close combat, we have to start figuring out morale and then making rolls on our conclusion to the close combat to see what kind of state these units are now in following that close combat. Maybe they're gung-ho to fight on, or maybe they have broken and making a run for the hills. That is a possibility as well. So then we also get some rules about retreats and rallying. Then we've got a ranged combat. I don't find the ranged combat to be as clunky as the close combat, but it is still maybe not as streamlined as I would have liked to have seen it. And once again, like I said, if this was a skirmish level game where maybe you had 10 models on a side, okay, fine. I'm all good. When we start getting tons of models out there and then you're having to look at all these different tables to figure different things out, it is going to turn things, at least in my opinion, into a bit of a slog, and it is going to become slower and slower based on the number of models you have in that scenario that you're playing. So I have gotten the things I'm not overly keen mostly out of the way. I do like the abilities, the various different spells, the rituals. I personally feel that there are a good number of unique units in this core book for each of the factions. I love the fact that we get a variety of factions too. So this isn't only the English and the Germans. No, we get some of the allies and the Central Powers. We get the United States Expeditionary Force, because of course now things aren't going to play out as they would historically in the First World War, because we have folk magic and pagan gods and monsters and spells and things like that. So I love the fact that we've got a lot of different factions and we have a lot of different unique units for each of the factions. Each of the factions is going to play a bit differently too. So I like that. We've got some customization rules too. So even the standard units aren't all going to be exactly the same. I thought that was very cool. I should point out though, I am disappointed that at no point in time do we ever see any images of miniatures in this book. And yes, I understand you can pretty much utilize any sort of miniatures you'd like. There isn't a particular brand of miniatures that you would use specifically for a War Transformed, because Osprey Games is not a miniature manufacturer. So I get that. And yes, Northwind Miniatures does provide a lot of sculpts for the various Osprey Games releases. So you've got that. But we don't even have artwork for these unique units, which I thought that was kind of weird. But I guess in some ways, not providing artwork or really giving a detailed description of what these different units look like does allow you to kind of kit bash and use whatever miniatures you would like. So I do understand that. It's just as far as presentation and inspiration for your gaming, I think it's a miss. I feel that I would have definitely preferred seeing some images of the various different unique units in order to really bring a War Transformed to life. Should also point out there are some vehicle rules in here. There aren't a ton of vehicles that are included. I could easily see an additional supplement coming out for a War Transformed if it's popular. I get into my final thoughts and review score. That is something I'm going to touch upon, because it's very possible that this is yet another one and done for Osprey Games. So we're going to wrap up with some rules for creating your own patrols. And for the most part, you're usually looking at between 20 and the aforementioned 50 models on a side for these various different scenarios. We're also going to get some reference tables and some templates to finish up the book. Although, strangely enough, not all of the various different tables you'd be utilizing are located in the one spot. Sadly, you're going to find yourself flipping back and forth constantly through this book until you really get the feel for how a War Transformed plays. Thankfully, The production quality of this book is very well done. I feel it should hold up to repeated use at your game table. All right, all that said, let's swing on over to the other camera so I can share some final thoughts and give my review score. So there are a lot of things I do like about A War Transformed. I like the setting. I think it's very unique. I think it's cool. I like the mashup of World War I and folk magic and sort of a mythos vibe without being the Cthulhu mythos to the proceedings. I love the fact that we've got a lot of unique units that will play differently and that the factions all will play differently. And there are also some rules to customize even just the line troops, and I like that quite a lot. Got to point out, mechanically, I think combat is clunky, especially the close combat. And I think the larger the battle, the more of a slog that this will become. I would have liked to have seen this far more streamlined because this is not a skirmish level game. In a skirmish level game where you have 8 to 10 models on a side, yeah, sure, it's okay looking up different tables and things like that, and having multiple die rolls taking place for your combat resolution. But in a situation where you might have 100 models on the table in a battle between two factions, essentially, I think there are far too many tables and too many dice rolls that are taking place for you to actually get into the combat resolution of, say, a close combat. I would have liked to have seen that streamlined a bit as well. It's disappointing that while the artwork itself that's in this book is really well done and I really like it, we're not getting artwork of the various different unique units. We're not even really getting much of a description of them either in order for you to try to accurately represent these things on the game table. Now, of course, I know Northwind Miniatures does have some miniatures available that are designed specifically for A War Transformed, but keep in mind, you're probably going to need to kit bash your models in order to field a big size patrol for A War Transformed. Last thing I do want to mention is there's no guarantee that we will see much support from Osprey Games for A War Transformed because, for the most part, normally when Osprey Games releases a miniatures game or even role-playing game, it's a one-and-done sort of thing. Now, of course, yes, there are exceptions to the rule. So we do have role-playing games like Jackals, and we have miniatures games like Frostgrave and Stargrave. But the majority of game releases that come out from Osprey Games tend to be one and done. And unfortunately, I have to give A War Transformed a bit of a knock because I don't know if we will see additional content for this game. Now, I should point out there is an errata that has arrived. I was pretty surprised at how many errors are in this book that were addressed in the errata. Of course, it doesn't change the mechanics of combat in any way, shape, or form. But at least we do have the errors addressed in a PDF, which you can download. I am curious to see what we see in the future for A War Transformed. If there are future releases, I would like to see some optional rules that maybe streamline the combat portion of the game. But I do like the setting and the units and things along those lines. So on a score of 0 to 10, I give A War Transformed a 6.5 out of 10. I do like it. I do have some major issues with it. And I would certainly like to see more for this setting arrive from Osprey Games. And hopefully, if we do see more releases, we'll also see some tweaks to the combat resolution section of the rules. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like this video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already, and if you do subscribe, ring that bell. It'll not only let you know when I upload videos such as this review, It'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. Central, right here on YouTube. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you will not find on the YouTube channel. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you very much for watching. And until I see you next time, here's hoping you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.